Every child deserves to feel safe in the arms that should protect them. But sometimes those very arms become the source of their deepest wounds. It is a betrayal so profound that it shakes the very foundation of what it means to love and be loved. When 2-year-old Aaliyah returns from her weekend visit more broken than ever before, Sister Mary's heart shatters as she recognizes the unmistakable signs of abuse written across the toddler's fragile body. The elderly nun has spent decades caring for forgotten children, but nothing prepared her for this moment, rushing Aaliyah to the emergency room while the little girl's cries echo through the hospital corridors. What the doctors discover sends shockwaves through their small town. Injuries so severe they immediately call the police. As Sister Mary stands vigil beside Aaliyah's hospital bed, she faces a question that will test her faith and her resolve. But what dark secret will the investigation uncover that changes everything they thought they knew? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered brick facade of St. Catherine's Children's Home, its golden light filtering through the ancient oak trees that had stood sentinel over this sanctuary for nearly a century. Sister Mary Catherine Murphy had walked these same stone steps every morning for 42 years. Her calloused hands tracing the smooth groove worn into the handrail by countless small fingers and worried palms. At 71, her spine had developed a gentle curve that spoke of decades spent bending down to comfort frightened children. Her silver hair now completely hidden beneath the simple white veil she had worn since taking her final vows in 1982. The children's home sat nestled in the heart of Millbrook, Ohio, a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the local diner still served coffee for 50 cents, and the evening news was whatever Mrs. Henderson heard at the post office. It was the kind of place where change came slowly, if at all, and where trust was built over generations of shared struggles and small kindnesses. Sister Mary had become as much a fixture of this community as the century-old courthouse, or the railroad tracks that still carried freight trains through town. Twice a day, this particular Monday morning felt different, though she couldn't quite place why. Perhaps it was the way the autumn air carried a sharper bite than usual, or how the children seemed more restless during breakfast, their usual chatter replaced by an underlying tension that made her chest tighten with maternal concern. She had learned to trust these instincts over 4 decades of caring for society's most vulnerable children, those whom the system had failed, forgotten, or simply couldn't place anywhere else. Aaliyah Washington had arrived at St. Catherine's 8 months ago, a tiny 2-year-old with enormous dark eyes that seemed to hold far too much sorrow for someone who had barely learned to speak in complete sentences. Her caseworker, Janet Palmer, had brought her on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening, explaining in hushed tones that the little girl's mother had died in a car accident, and that her father, Marcus Washington, was struggling to provide adequate care while working double shifts at the steel plant 40 miles away in Canton. "She's been through enough trauma," Janet had whispered as they watched Aaliyah curl up in the corner of the playroom, clutching a threadbare stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. "Her father loves her, but he's barely keeping his head above water financially. The weekend visits are court-ordered, gives him time to get his life together while ensuring Aaliyah has stable care during the week." Sister Mary had nodded, understanding the delicate balance these arrangements required. She had seen hundreds of similar cases over the years, children caught between impossible circumstances and a system that meant well but often moved too slowly to heal the wounds it was designed to address. What made Aaliyah different was not her circumstances, but the way she carried herself, a wariness that seemed beyond her years, as if she had already learned that the world was not a safe place for little girls who looked like her. The weekend visits had begun 2 months after Aaliyah's arrival. Every Friday evening, Jennifer Walsh would arrive in her pristine white SUV, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her smile bright but somehow cold around the edges. Marcus had married Jennifer 6 weeks after Aaliyah came to St. Catherine's, a whirlwind romance that had surprised everyone, including his own family. Jennifer was everything Marcus's late wife had not been: wealthy, connected, and white, in a way that opened doors in their small Ohio town that had remained stubbornly closed to others. "I know this is an adjustment," Jennifer had said during their first meeting, her manicured hands gesturing gracefully as she spoke. "But I want you to know that I'm committed to making this work. Aaliyah deserves a real family, and Marcus and I can provide that stability she needs." Sister Mary had wanted to believe her. Everything about Jennifer Walsh suggested success and competence: her expensive clothes, her confident manner, the way she spoke about child development, using terms that clearly came from parenting books and internet research. But there was something in Jennifer's eyes when she looked at Aaliyah, a flicker of something that made Sister Mary's stomach clench, with an unease she couldn't quite articulate. The first few weekend visits had gone smoothly enough. Aaliyah would return on Sunday evenings tired, but seemingly unharmed, though she always seemed to withdraw into herself for several days afterward. Sister Mary had attributed this to the natural difficulty of transition, moving between worlds, trying to understand where she belonged in the complicated dynamics of a blended family that included a stepmother who had never raised children and a father struggling with his own grief and guilt. But over the past month, the changes in Aaliyah had become impossible to ignore. The little girl, who had slowly begun to smile and play with the other children, now spent most of her time sitting quietly in corners, her dark eyes following the adults around her with a hypervigilance that broke Sister Mary's heart. She had started wetting the bed again, something she hadn't done since her first week at the home. Her appetite had diminished, to the point where Sister Mary had to coax her to eat even her favorite foods: apple, slices with peanut butter, and the chocolate chip cookies they baked together every Wednesday afternoon. Most troubling of all was what happened every Friday when Jennifer came to collect her. Aaliyah would begin crying hours before her stepmother's arrival, clinging to Sister Mary's habit with tiny fists that seemed surprisingly strong for someone so small. "No, go," she would whisper, her voice barely audible. "Stay, Sister Mary, stay." Each time, Sister Mary's heart would break a little more, but the court order was clear. Weekend visits were mandatory unless there was documented evidence of abuse or neglect, and Aaliyah always returned physically unharmed, at least on the surface. There were no visible bruises, no obvious signs of mistreatment, nothing that would justify violating a court order or separating a father from his daughter during their precious time together. This morning, however, as Sister Mary helped Aaliyah with breakfast, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. When she gently guided the little girl's hand to help her hold the spoon properly, Aaliyah flinched and pulled away with a sharp intake of breath that spoke of recent pain. The reaction was subtle. Someone less experienced might have missed it entirely, but Sister Mary had seen enough frightened children to recognize the signs of someone expecting to be hurt. "Aaliyah, sweetheart," she said softly, kneeling down beside the child's chair so they were at eye level. "Did something happen to your hand?" The little girl's eyes widened with what looked like fear, and she quickly shook her head, tucking both hands under the table where Sister Mary couldn't see them. "No hurt," she whispered, but her voice carried a tremor that suggested otherwise. Sister Mary felt her chest tighten with a familiar combination of anger and helplessness. She had been in this position too many times before, knowing in her heart that something was wrong, but lacking the concrete evidence needed to protect a child who couldn't protect herself. The system required documentation, proof, medical reports, and witness statements. It didn't account for the instincts of an elderly nun who had spent her entire adult life learning to read the unspoken language of trauma in the eyes of forgotten children. As she watched Aaliyah struggle to eat her cereal with obvious discomfort, Sister Mary made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She would not let another weekend pass without knowing exactly what was happening to this precious child. If that meant bending rules, challenging authority, or risking her own position at the children's home, so be it. Some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the personal cost. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine activities: circle time, arts and crafts, outdoor play when the weather permitted. But Sister Mary found herself watching Aaliyah more closely than usual, noting every small gesture, every moment of hesitation, every flicker of fear that crossed the child's expressive face. What she saw confirmed her worst suspicions. This was a little girl who had learned to expect pain, who moved through the world with the careful precision of someone much older, someone who had already discovered that the people who claimed to love her could also be the source of her deepest suffering. By the time Jennifer's white SUV pulled into the circular drive at exactly 5 o'clock that Friday evening, Sister Mary had made up her mind. She would not simply hand Aaliyah over and hope for the best. This time, she would pay attention to every detail, document every concern, and, if necessary, take action that went far beyond the comfortable boundaries of her role as a caregiver. As Jennifer approached the front entrance with her usual confident stride, Sister Mary whispered a prayer that had sustained her through 42 years of difficult decisions. Grant me the wisdom to know when to bend the rules in service of a higher law, and the courage to act when a child's life hangs in the balance. The weekend that followed would test every principle she had ever held dear about faith, justice, and the sacred duty to protect those who could not protect themselves. Sunday evening arrived with the weight of impending storm clouds gathering over Millbrook, the air thick with humidity that made everyone's movements feel sluggish and deliberate. Sister Mary stood at the kitchen window of St. Catherine's, her weathered hands gripping the edge of the porcelain sink as she watched for the familiar white SUV that would bring Aaliyah home from another weekend with her father and stepmother. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times, an hour past the usual return time, and with each passing minute, the knot in Sister Mary's stomach grew tighter. When Jennifer's vehicle finally pulled into the circular drive, Sister Mary's trained eye immediately noticed something was wrong. The SUV sat idling for nearly 5 minutes before the driver's door opened, and when Jennifer finally emerged, her usual pristine appearance was disheveled. Her blonde hair hung limp around her shoulders, her makeup smudged as if she had been crying, and she moved with the jerky, uncertain movements of someone trying very hard to appear normal while falling apart inside. But it was Aaliyah who made Sister Mary's blood turn to ice water in her veins. The little girl, who had left on Friday afternoon chattering about her stuffed rabbit, now sat motionless in her car seat, her dark eyes staring straight ahead with the vacant expression of someone who had retreated so far inside herself that the outside world could no longer reach her. When Jennifer opened the rear door and began fumbling with the car seat straps, Aaliyah didn't react at all. No excitement about returning home, no reaching for familiar faces. Nothing but an eerie stillness that reminded Sister Mary of the traumatized children she had seen in her earliest years at the home, back when the system was even more broken than it was now. "She's been a little fussy today," Jennifer called out as she lifted Aaliyah from the car seat, her voice pitched higher than usual, the words tumbling out too quickly. "I think she might be coming down with something. Kids pick up everything these days, don't they? Marcus had to work late tonight, double shift at the plant, so he asked me to drop her off myself." Sister Mary descended the front steps slowly, her eyes never leaving Aaliyah's face as she approached. The child hung limp in Jennifer's arms like a broken doll, her little head lolling against her stepmother's shoulder with none of the natural fidgeting that characterized toddlers her age. When Sister Mary reached out to take her, Aaliyah's body was unnaturally rigid, as if every muscle had locked into a defensive position. "Come to Sister Mary, sweetheart," she whispered, and as her hands made contact with Aaliyah's small form, the little girl let out a sharp cry of pain that cut through the evening air like a blade. Sister Mary's hands immediately stilled, her nursing training from decades past flooding back as she recognized the unmistakable sound of someone in physical distress. What happened? Sister Mary's voice carried a steel edge that made Jennifer take an involuntary step backward. "Oh, she's hurt. I told you she's been fussy all day," Jennifer stammered, her hands twisting the designer purse strap around her fingers. "Probably just tired. You know how cranky they get when they don't nap properly. I tried to get her to sleep, but she kept crying and crying." "And this isn't tired," Sister Mary interrupted, her voice low and dangerous as she carefully adjusted her hold on Aaliyah to avoid causing further pain. "This is a child who has been injured." Jennifer's face flushed red, then went pale, then red again. "I resent what you're implying, sister. Marcus and I love Aaliyah very much. Sometimes children hurt themselves playing. They fall, they bump into things. You can't watch them every single second." But Sister Mary was no longer listening to Jennifer's increasingly frantic explanations. Her entire focus had narrowed to the small, broken child in her arms, and what she felt beneath her gentle touch made her stomach clench with horror and rage. Aaliyah's left arm hung at an unnatural angle, and when Sister Mary very carefully lifted the child's shirt, she could see the mottled purple bruising that spoke of trauma far beyond what any fall or accident could cause. "Get out," Sister Mary said quietly, her voice carrying 42 years of authority and righteous anger. "Excuse me." Jennifer's voice cracked on the words. "I said get out, now, before I call the police myself." Jennifer's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound emerged. You don't have the authority. The court order clearly states—" "The court order," Sister Mary said, taking a step closer to Jennifer while clutching Aaliyah protectively against her chest, "does not require me to return an injured child to the people who hurt her. And if you don't get in that vehicle and drive away right now, I will make sure every person in this town knows exactly what kind of woman you really are." For a moment, the two women faced each other in the gathering dusk, the tension crackling between them like electricity before a lightning strike. Jennifer's face cycled through a dozen emotions: fear, anger, desperation, calculation, before finally settling on a cold mask that revealed more about her true nature than any words could have. "You're making a huge mistake," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "Marcus won't stand for this. Our lawyer won't stand for this. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." "Old woman, try me," Sister Mary replied, and something in her tone made Jennifer take another step backward. Without another word, Jennifer spun on her heel and stalked back to her SUV, slamming the door with enough force to make Aaliyah whimper softly against Sister Mary's shoulder. The vehicle roared to life and disappeared down the tree-lined street, leaving behind only the smell of burning rubber and the sound of Sister Mary's heart hammering against her ribs. The moment they were alone, Sister Mary carried Aaliyah inside and straight to her small office, where she kept a first aid kit and had access to the phone. Her hands shook as she dialed the number for Millbrook General Hospital's emergency department, and when the familiar voice of Dr. Patricia Reynolds answered, Sister Mary felt her first moment of relief in hours. "Pat, it's Mary Murphy at St. Catherine's. I need you to listen very carefully because I'm about to bring you a little girl who has been severely injured, and I believe it was intentional." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several heartbeats before Dr. Reynolds responded. "How severe are we talking, Mary?" "Broken arm at minimum, extensive bruising, possible internal injuries. She's 2 years old, and she's been in the system for 8 months. Weekend visits with father and stepmother. Jesus Christ." Dr. Reynolds had known Sister Mary for over 20 years, and she understood that the nun would never make such an accusation lightly. "Bring her in through the ambulance bay. I'll have a team ready, and I'll call social services myself." "No," Sister Mary said firmly. "Not social services, not yet. Call Detective Sarah Chen first. She specializes in domestic violence cases, and she'll know how to handle this properly. Social services has been involved from the beginning, And they've failed this child repeatedly. Mary, you know I have to follow protocol. Patricia, Sister Mary interrupted, using the formal name she reserved for moments when she needed to be heard above all else. This little girl is barely clinging to consciousness. Whatever happened to her this weekend nearly killed her. If we don't handle this exactly right, she'll be dead before her 3rd birthday. Please. Another pause, longer this time, before Dr. Reynolds sighed heavily. Detective Chen first, then social services. But Mary, you need to understand that this is going to get very complicated very quickly. I know, Sister Mary whispered, looking down at Aaliyah's still form. But she's worth it. They're all worth it, as she hung up the phone and prepared to make the drive that would change everything. Sister Mary whispered a prayer that was part plea, part promise. Give me the strength to see this through, and the wisdom to navigate whatever comes next. This child will not suffer alone. Outside, the storm clouds finally opened, sending sheets of rain against the windows of St. Catherine's Children's Home, as if the sky itself was weeping for all the broken children in the world. The fluorescent lights of Millbrook General Hospital's emergency department cast everything in harsh, unforgiving white as Sister Mary paced the cramped family consultation room, her rosary beads clicking softly between her fingers. Through the thin walls, she could hear the controlled chaos of the trauma bay where Dr. Reynolds and her team worked to assess the full extent of Aaliyah's injuries. Each muffled voice, each beeping monitor, each hurried footstep in the corridor outside made Sister Mary's chest tighten with a combination of hope and dread that had become painfully familiar over her decades of emergency room vigils. Detective Sarah. Chen arrived within 20 minutes of Dr. Reynolds' call, her presence immediately filling the small room with an energy that was both reassuring and intimidating. At 45, Detective Chen carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen the worst of human nature and refused to let it break her spirit. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her kind eyes held the particular mixture of compassion and steel that Sister Mary recognized in people who had dedicated their lives to protecting others. "Sister Mary," Detective Chen said, extending her hand in greeting. "Dr. Reynolds briefed me on the phone, but I need to hear everything directly from you. Every detail, no matter how small it might seem." Sister Mary sank into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs and began to recount the events of the evening. But as she spoke, her narrative expanded to include weeks of growing concern, subtle changes in Aaliyah's behavior, and the nagging intuition that something was deeply wrong in the Washington household. Detective Chen listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes in a small leather notebook, her expression growing more grim with each detail. "The stepmother's reaction when you confronted her," Detective Chen said when Sister Mary finished. "Can you describe that more specifically?" "Fear," Sister Mary replied without hesitation. "But not the kind of fear you'd expect from someone who had been falsely accused. It was the fear of someone who knew they'd been caught." Before Detective Chen could respond, Dr. Reynolds appeared in the doorway, her scrubs rumpled and her face etched with the kind of exhaustion that came from delivering terrible news to people she cared about. She pulled off her latex gloves and disposed of them with movements that were too careful, too controlled, as if she was using the mundane action to gather herself before speaking. "How bad?" Sister Mary asked, rising from her chair. "Worse than I hoped, not as bad as I feared," Dr. Reynolds said, gesturing for both women to sit. "Displaced fracture of the left radius, that's the forearm bone. Multiple contusions consistent with grip marks on both upper arms. Bruising around the rib cage that suggests she was squeezed or compressed with significant force. No internal bleeding, thank God, but there are older injuries that are partially healed." Detective Chen looked up sharply from her notebook. "Older injuries?" "Healing fractures in 2 ribs that are probably 3 to 4 weeks old. Faded bruising in areas that would be hidden by clothing. This has been going on for a while." Sister Mary felt the room spin slightly around her as the full implications of Dr. Reynolds's words sank in. "I failed her," she whispered, more to herself than to the others. I knew something was wrong and I let it continue. No, Detective Chen said firmly, leaning forward in her chair. The system failed her. You're the one who finally acted when it mattered most. Without you, this would have continued until she was seriously injured or killed. Dr. Reynolds nodded in agreement. I've already filed the mandatory reports with Child Protective Services and the state police. Aaliyah will not be returning to that home under any circumstances. But I need you both to understand. What we're dealing with here is systematic, deliberate abuse. This wasn't accidental, and it wasn't a one-time incident. The social services file that Detective Chen retrieved from the county office later that evening painted a picture that made Sister Mary's blood boil with righteous fury. Aaliyah Washington's case history stretched back 8 months, filled with routine check-ins, progress reports, and evaluation forms that had somehow missed clear signs of escalating abuse. Janet Palmer, the caseworker assigned to Aaliyah's case, had conducted exactly 3 home visits during the stepmother's tenure, each one scheduled well in advance, and each one resulting in glowing reports about the stable family environment Jennifer Walsh was providing. "Look at this," Detective Chen said, spreading the papers across the conference table in the hospital's administrative wing. Every single report mentions Aaliyah's adjustment difficulties and recommends patience and consistency from the caregivers. Not once does anyone question whether the home environment might be causing those difficulties. Sister Mary studied the photographs stapled to various forms, images of Aaliyah during supervised visits, during court hearings, during medical checkups. In every single picture, the little girl appeared withdrawn, her eyes holding that same hollow expression Sister Mary had learned to recognize as a sign of trauma. Yet somehow, a system designed to protect children had interpreted that expression as evidence of normal adjustment stress. "Here's what really makes me angry," Detective Chen continued, pointing to a section highlighted in yellow. Jennifer Walsh underwent the standard background check and parenting classes required for step-parent adoption proceedings. She passed everything with flying colors, perfect attendance, excellent scores on all the assessments, glowing recommendations from the instructors. "How is that possible?" Sister Mary asked. "Because the system is designed to identify obvious problems. Criminal records, substance abuse, mental health crises that result in hospitalization. It's not designed to identify people who are skilled at manipulation and control. Jennifer Walsh is intelligent, educated, and knows exactly how to present herself to authority figures. She's also, apparently, a sociopath who has been systematically torturing a 2-year-old child. The weight of that statement settled over them like a suffocating blanket. Sister Mary had encountered evil before in her 4 decades of working with damaged children. But it never became easier to accept the reality that some people derived satisfaction from causing pain to those who could not defend themselves. Dr. Reynolds rejoined them an hour later with updates on Aaliyah's condition. "She's stable, sleeping naturally now. I've given her something for the pain, and we've set the fracture properly. She'll need surgery in the morning to insert pins, but that's routine for this type of break. What concerns me more is her psychological state. She hasn't spoken a word since you brought her in, and she flinches away from any physical contact. Can I sit with her?" Sister Mary asked. "I was hoping you would. She's in pediatric room 12, and I've made arrangements for you to stay overnight if you want. The nurses tell me she keeps looking toward the door, as if she's waiting for someone." As Sister Mary made her way through the hospital corridors toward Aaliyah's room, she carried with her not just the weight of the child's suffering, but also a growing determination to ensure that justice would be served. The social services file tucked under her arm represented years of systemic failures, but it also contained the evidence that would be needed to build a case against Jennifer Walsh. When she reached room 12 and saw Aaliyah's small form dwarfed by the hospital bed, her left arm encased in a bright pink cast, Sister Mary whispered a promise that would guide her actions in the difficult days ahead. "No more weekends away, sweetheart. No more being hurt by people who are supposed to love you. Sister Mary is here now, and I'm not going anywhere. The night hours in pediatric room 12 passed with the surreal quality of a waking dream, where time seemed both suspended and accelerated. Sister Mary had pulled the vinyl reclining chair as close to Aaliyah's bed as possible, her weathered hand resting gently on the hospital blanket near the child's uninjured arm. Every few minutes, Aaliyah would stir restlessly, her dark eyes fluttering open to search the dimly lit room before finding Sister Mary's face and settling back into an uneasy sleep. It was during one of these quiet moments, around 3 in the morning, that Aaliyah finally spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, so soft that Sister Mary had to lean forward to catch the words. "Sister Mary, stay." "Yes, sweetheart," Sister Mary replied, her own voice thick with emotion. "Sister Mary stays, always." Aaliyah's good hand moved slightly under the blanket, reaching towards Sister Mary with fingers that trembled like butterfly wings. When their hands touched, the little girl's grip was surprisingly strong, as if she was anchoring herself to the one person in her world who represented safety and unconditional love. "Bad lady hurt Aaliyah," the child whispered, and the simple statement carried more weight than any legal testimony could convey. Sister Mary felt her heart break and mend simultaneously. "I know, baby, I know. But the bad lady can't hurt you anymore." Sister Mary won't let her. The morning brought a flurry of activity that transformed the quiet hospital room into a hub of official business. Janet Palmer, the social services caseworker, arrived first. Her clipboard clutched defensively against her chest, and her professional smile failing to mask the obvious stress etched around her eyes. Behind her came Marcus Washington, Aaliyah's father, looking like a man who had aged 10 years overnight. Marcus was a big man, with calloused hands that spoke of honest labor and shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world. But as he stood in the doorway of his daughter's hospital room, he seemed to shrink into himself. His dark skin had an ashen undertone that suggested he hadn't slept, and his usually immaculate work clothes were wrinkled as if he had thrown them on in haste. "Oh, God," he breathed when he saw Aaliyah's cast and the IV tube running into her small arm. "What did she do to my baby?" Sister Mary rose from her chair, studying Marcus's face carefully. His shock and anguish appeared genuine, but she had learned over the years that appearances could be deceiving, especially when it came to family dynamics and domestic violence. Still, something in his expression, a combination of devastation and dawning realization, suggested that he truly had not known the extent of what was happening to his daughter. "Mr. Washington," Janet Palmer began, consulting her clipboard with the nervous efficiency of someone trying to maintain control of a rapidly deteriorating situation. "I need to inform you that temporary custody of Aaliyah has been transferred to the state pending a full investigation." "You won't be able to take her home today." Marcus's face crumpled as if he had been physically struck. "But I didn't. I would never hurt her. I love my daughter more than my own life. The investigation will determine everyone's level of involvement or knowledge," Detective Chen said, entering the room with Father Miguel Rodriguez, the hospital chaplain who had become Sister Mary's closest ally in navigating the complex intersection of faith and justice that cases like this demanded. Father Miguel was a compact man in his 50s, with graying temples and the kind of gentle presence that invited confession and confidence. He had worked with Sister Mary on dozens of difficult cases over the past decade, and his understanding of both canon law and civil rights had proven invaluable in situations where the institutional church and secular authorities needed to work together. "Marcus," Detective Chen continued, "I need you to tell me everything you know about your wife's relationship with Aaliyah. Everything, even things that seemed minor or unimportant at the time." What followed was a conversation that laid bare the anatomy of manipulation and control that had characterized Jennifer's integration into the Washington family. Marcus spoke haltingly at first, Then, with increasing clarity, as the pieces of a puzzle he had been unconsciously assembling for months finally began to form a coherent picture. "She was so good with Aaliyah at first," he said, his voice heavy with guilt and self-recrimination. "Patient, caring, always talking about child development and proper nutrition. She read all these books about blended families and trauma-informed parenting. I thought, God help me. I thought I had found someone who could give my daughter everything I couldn't provide on my own." Sister Mary exchanged glances with Father Miguel. They had both seen this pattern before. Predators who presented themselves as saviors, who used their apparent expertise and dedication to gain access to vulnerable children and the trust of overwhelmed parents. "When did things start to change?" Detective Chen asked gently. Marcus rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of a man trying to wake up from a nightmare. "Gradually. So gradually I almost didn't notice. Jennifer started insisting that Aaliyah needed more structure, more discipline. She said the other children at the group home were a bad influence, that Aaliyah was picking up behavioral problems that needed to be corrected immediately." "What kind of corrections?" Father Miguel asked, though Sister Mary could tell from his expression that he already suspected the answer. "Timeouts that lasted for hours. Taking away meals if Aaliyah didn't eat fast enough or clean enough. Jennifer said it was important to establish boundaries, that I was too soft because of guilt over her mother's death." Marcus's voice broke slightly. "She made it sound like love, like she was the only one willing to do the hard work of raising my daughter properly." Sister Mary felt a familiar rage building in her chest. The same righteous anger that had sustained her through 4 decades of fighting for children who had no other advocates. Jennifer Walsh had used Marcus's grief and guilt as weapons against him, exploiting his love for his daughter to gain control over both their lives. "Mr. Washington," Sister Mary said quietly, "did you ever see Jennifer discipline Aaliyah physically?" Marcus shook his head, but the gesture carried more uncertainty than conviction. "She said physical punishment was counterproductive, that there were more effective ways to shape behavior. But now—" He looked at his sleeping daughter, her small form dwarfed by the hospital equipment. "Now I wonder what was happening when I wasn't there. I worked such long hours, and Jennifer kept saying she needed time alone with Aaliyah to build their relationship. The weight of missed signs and ignored. Instincts hung heavy in the room as each adult grappled with their own role in the system that had failed to protect Aaliyah. But Sister Mary refused to let despair take root. There would be time for self-recrimination later. Right now, the focus had to be on ensuring that justice was served and that Aaliyah's future would be different from her recent past. As the morning sun streamed through the hospital room windows, Sister Mary made a silent vow that would guide her actions in the difficult days ahead. No matter what it cost her personally or professionally, she would see this through to the end. 3 days after Aaliyah's hospitalization, the small conference room at the Millbrook County Child Protective Services office had become a battleground where legal procedures clashed with moral imperatives. Sister Mary sat rigidly in her chair, her spine straight despite the uncomfortable plastic seat, watching as a parade of officials, lawyers, and social workers debated the future of a little girl who was still recovering from surgery to repair bones broken by someone who had promised to love her. Jennifer Walsh's attorney, Robert Garrison, commanded the room with the kind of aggressive confidence that money could buy. He was a man in his early 60s, silver-haired and expensively dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to winning through intimidation rather than merit. His presence seemed to suck the oxygen from the room as he spread legal documents across the conference table like a general deploying troops. "My client categorically denies any wrongdoing," Garrison announced, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had spent decades defending the indefensible. "The allegations against Mrs. Walsh are based entirely on speculation and the unreliable testimony of a traumatized child who cannot be considered a credible witness due to her age and emotional state, Sister." Mary's hands clenched involuntarily in her lap, her rosary beads cutting into her palms as she fought to maintain her composure. Across the table, Detective Chen's jaw was set in a way that suggested she was exercising similar restraint. "Mr. Garrison," Detective Chen said carefully, "the medical evidence speaks for itself. Multiple fractures in various stages of healing, bruising patterns consistent with inflicted trauma, and documented behavioral changes that align with abuse victims. Your client's denials don't change the physical facts." Garrison's smile was thin and calculating. "Physical facts that could be explained by any number of alternative scenarios. Children are naturally clumsy, Detective. They fall, they hurt themselves, they have accidents. The fact that this particular child has been in the foster care system suggests she may have pre-existing behavioral and psychological issues that could contribute to self-harm or increased vulnerability to accidental injury." Sister Mary felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest as she realized what Garrison was doing. He was attempting to use Aaliyah's traumatic history, the very thing that should have made adults more protective of her, as a weapon to discredit her suffering and deflect blame from her. "Abuser, that's enough," Sister Mary said quietly, her voice cutting through Garrison's practiced rhetoric like a blade through silk. "That little girl did not break her own arm. She did not bruise her own ribs. And she certainly did not inflict the kind of systematic psychological damage that has left her afraid to sleep without someone holding her hand." Garrison turned his cold gaze toward Sister Mary, and she could see him calculating how to neutralize what he clearly viewed as an inconvenient witness. "Sister Murphy, while your emotional investment in this case is understandable, emotional reactions are not evidence. Courts require proof, not feelings." "Then let me give you proof," Sister Mary replied, reaching into the worn leather satchel she had carried to countless meetings over the decades. From it she withdrew a manila folder that contained photocopies of something that made Garrison's confident expression falter for the first time since he had entered the room. The drawings had been created during Aaliyah's art therapy sessions at St. Catherine's. Over the past 2 months, crude but unmistakable images rendered in crayon that told a story no 2-year-old should have been able to tell. In the first drawing, dated 6 weeks earlier, stick figures representing a family stood together under a bright yellow sun. But as the dates progressed, the drawings became increasingly dark and chaotic, black scribbles that covered most of the page, red marks that could only represent blood or pain, and in the most recent drawing, a small figure cowering in the corner while a larger figure loomed overhead with arms raised. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the child psychologist who had been working with Aaliyah, had annotated each drawing with clinical observations that painted a picture of a child's psychological deterioration in real time. The progression was so clear, so obviously connected to the weekend visits, that even Garrison seemed momentarily at a loss for words. "These drawings were created during supervised art therapy sessions," Sister Mary said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "Each one is dated and witnessed. They show a clear pattern of escalating fear and trauma that coincides exactly with the period when Jennifer Walsh became Aaliyah's primary weekend caregiver." Janet Palmer, who had been notably quiet throughout the meeting, finally spoke up. "Sister Mary, while these drawings are certainly concerning, we have to be careful about reading too much into children's artwork. Sometimes a scribble is just a scribble. Sometimes," Father Miguel interjected from his position near the window, "a scribble is a child's only way of screaming for help when the adults around her have failed to hear her words." The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch as the various factions, legal, medical, social services, and faith-based, found themselves aligned in an uncomfortable dance around a truth that was simultaneously obvious and legally complicated. Sister Mary could see the calculations happening behind everyone's eyes. Who had liability? Who could be blamed? Who could be protected? And who could be sacrificed to maintain the illusion that the system was working as intended? It was Detective Chen, who finally cut through the institutional, posturing with the kind of direct statement that reminded everyone why they were really there. "Here's what I know," she said, standing up and addressing the room with quiet authority. A 2-year-old child was systematically tortured for months, while every adult responsible for her protection either failed to see what was happening or chose to ignore it. Whether that happened through malice or incompetence doesn't matter to Aaliyah. The result is the same. She paused, letting her words settle over the room like a verdict. What matters now is making sure it never happens again. To her or to any other child who finds themselves trapped in a system that values procedure over protection. Garrison opened his mouth to object, but Detective Chen held up her hand. "I'm not finished. Mrs. Walsh will be arrested and charged with multiple counts of child abuse. The evidence is overwhelming, and any attempt to blame the victim or deflect responsibility will be met with the full force of the law. This case will go to trial, and when it does, every person in this room will have to explain their role in what happened to Aaliyah Washington." As the meeting dissolved into heated discussions about jurisdictions, procedures and legal strategies, Sister Mary found herself thinking about Aaliyah, who was at that moment coloring in a new notebook in her hospital room, her small hand working carefully around the cast on her arm to create pictures that, for the first time in months, included bright colors and smiling faces. The battle for justice was just beginning. But for the first time since this nightmare started, Sister Mary felt something that had been absent for far too long. Hope. The arrest warrant for Jennifer Walsh was executed on a crisp Thursday morning that would forever be etched in Sister Mary's memory. She had insisted on being present, not out of vindictiveness, but because she needed to see with her own eyes that the legal system was finally taking action to protect Aaliyah. Detective Chen had reluctantly agreed, understanding that Sister Mary's involvement in this case went far beyond professional duty. It had become a crusade for every child who had ever been failed by the adults sworn to protect them. Jennifer's house sat in the most exclusive neighborhood in Millbrook, a sprawling colonial with manicured lawns and the kind of pristine exterior that whispered of wealth and respectability. As the police vehicles pulled into the circular driveway, Sister Mary couldn't help but think about how appearances could mask the most horrific realities. Behind these perfect walls, a little girl had been systematically tortured while neighbors went about their daily lives, never suspecting that evil could wear such an attractive facade. Jennifer answered the door wearing a silk robe and an expression of manufactured outrage that quickly crumbled when she saw Detective Chen's badge and the formal papers in her hand. "This is harassment," she said, but her voice lacked the conviction it had carried during their confrontations at the hospital and social services office. "My attorney will have your badge for this." "Mrs. Jennifer Walsh," Detective Chen said, her voice carrying the weight of official authority. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of child abuse, aggravated assault on a minor, and endangering the welfare of a child. You have the right to remain silent." The reading of Miranda rights seemed to stretch on forever as Sister Mary watched Jennifer's carefully constructed mask finally slip away completely. The woman who had presented herself as a loving stepmother, who had charmed caseworkers and fooled a grieving father, revealed herself to be exactly what Sister Mary had suspected from the beginning. A predator who had used her intelligence and social position to gain access to a vulnerable child. But it was what happened next that would haunt Sister Mary's dreams for months to come. As the handcuffs clicked into place around Jennifer's wrists, the woman turned toward Sister Mary with a smile that was pure malice, devoid of any pretense of humanity. "You think you've won something here, old woman?" Jennifer hissed, her voice low enough that only Sister Mary could hear. "You have no idea what you've started. That little brat will be back in the system within 6 months, and there will be others just like her. There are always others. The system protects people like me, not children like her. The words hit Sister Mary like physical blows, not because she believed them, but because she recognized the kernel of truth they contained. The system was broken, had always been broken, and would continue to be broken as long as people prioritized appearances over substance, procedure over protection, and institutional comfort over moral courage. As Jennifer was led away in handcuffs, Sister Mary felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and dread settling in her chest. Justice was being served, but at what cost? And what would happen to Aaliyah when the cameras went away and the public attention moved on to other tragedies? The media attention that followed Jennifer's arrest was both blessing and curse. Local news stations picked up the story within hours, and by evening, national outlets were calling it a cautionary tale about the failures of the child welfare system. Sister Mary found herself thrust into an unwelcome spotlight, with reporters camping outside St. Catherine's and requesting interviews about her role in exposing the abuse. Sister Mary, how did you know that Aaliyah was being abused when trained social workers missed the signs? Asked a young reporter with perfectly styled hair and an earnest expression that suggested she was new to covering stories that involved real human suffering. Sister Mary stood on the front steps of St. Catherine's, the place that had been her home and sanctuary for over 4 decades, and struggled to find words that could bridge the gap between professional obligation and moral necessity. "I knew because I listened," she finally said. "I listened when a little girl's body language told me she was afraid. I listened when her behavior changed in ways that spoke of trauma. And most importantly, I listened when she finally found the courage to tell me what was happening to her. But why didn't the official system catch these signs?" pressed another reporter. Sister Mary's response was measured but firm. "Because systems are made up of people, and people can choose to see what they want to see. When you're more concerned about following procedures than protecting children, when you're more worried about liability than love, when you value institutional reputation over individual welfare, that's when children fall through the cracks." The interview footage aired that evening on 3 different networks, and by the next morning, Sister Mary's phone was ringing constantly with calls from other caregivers, other advocates, and other survivors who wanted to share their own stories of systemic failure and individual courage. Each conversation reinforced what Sister Mary had always known, but had never articulated so clearly. The fight for Aaliyah was just one battle in a much larger war. Marcus Washington visited Aaliyah every day during her hospital stay, bringing flowers, stuffed animals, and a quiet desperation that broke Sister Mary's heart. He would sit beside his daughter's bed for hours, reading picture books in a voice thick with guilt and grief, apologizing repeatedly for choices that had seemed reasonable at the time, but had led to such devastating consequences. "I should have known," he said to Sister Mary during one of these visits, his large hands dwarfing the children's book he held. "I'm her father. I should have protected her." "You couldn't have known what you weren't allowed to see," Sister Mary replied gently. Jennifer was skilled at manipulation and control. "She used your love for Aaliyah against both of you. But the signs were there, weren't they? Looking back, I can see them now. The way Aaliyah would get quiet before weekend visits. How she seemed to regress in her development. The bruises that Jennifer always had explanations for. Marcus's voice cracked with the weight of his self-recrimination. Sister Mary reached across the space between their chairs and placed her weathered hand over his. "The important thing is that you see them now, that you're willing to fight for her now. That's what matters moving forward." As Aaliyah's physical wounds began to heal, her psychological recovery proved more complex and challenging. Dr. Martinez worked with her daily, using play therapy and art to help the little girl process trauma that was far beyond her developmental capacity to understand. But gradually, slowly, Aaliyah began to emerge from the shell of fear that had enclosed her for months. The day she laughed, really laughed, for the first time since her hospitalization, Sister Mary felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of hope and healing. The revelation came on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after Jennifer's arrest, delivered by Detective Chen in the form of a manila envelope that would forever change how Sister Mary understood the scope of the evil they had been fighting. The detective's face was ashen as she spread the contents across the conference table in St. Catherine's administrative office, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged photographs, documents, and computer printouts that painted a picture so horrific it challenged everything they thought they knew about Jennifer Walsh. "We found these when we executed the search warrant on Jennifer's home computer," Detective Chen said, her voice carefully controlled in the way of someone delivering devastating news. "What we discovered goes far beyond what happened to Aaliyah. The first photograph showed Jennifer with another child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 4 years old, his face partially obscured, but his body language unmistakably fearful. According to the metadata, the image had been taken 18 months earlier in a different state. The second photograph showed the same child with visible injuries, similar to what Aaliyah had suffered. The third showed a different child entirely, a little girl with blonde hair and blue eyes who bore bruises that told their own terrible story." "How many?" Sister Mary whispered, her rosary beads cutting into her palms as she gripped them with white-knuckled intensity. "We've identified 7 children across 3 states over the past 5 years. Detective Chen replied. "All of them were in vulnerable situations: foster care, single-parent homes, families dealing with crisis or trauma. Jennifer has a pattern of targeting grieving or overwhelmed parents who are desperate for help with their children." Father Miguel, who had been reviewing the documents with the careful attention of someone trained in canon law, looked up with an expression of profound sorrow. "She's a serial predator. This wasn't about Aaliyah specifically. This was about finding vulnerable children and exploiting the systems designed to protect them." The computer evidence revealed a methodical approach that was chilling in its calculated precision. Jennifer had maintained detailed files on each family she had infiltrated, including psychological profiles of the parents, financial information, and what she called vulnerability assessments that read like a predator's playbook for manipulation and control. "Look at this," Detective Chen said, pointing to a document titled Project Integration Washington Family. She researched Marcus for months before they ever met. She knew about his wife's death, his work schedule, his financial struggles, even his mother's medical condition. Their meeting wasn't coincidental. It was planned. Sister Mary felt the room spin as the implications sank in. Jennifer hadn't simply been an abusive stepmother who had lost control. She had been a sophisticated predator who had specifically targeted Marcus and Aaliyah as part of a larger pattern of abuse that stretched across multiple states and years. "The other children," Sister Mary said, her voice barely audible. "What happened to them?" Detective Chen's expression grew even more grim. 2 are deceased, one from injuries that were ruled accidental at the time, but are now being investigated as homicides. The other from what was originally classified as SIDS, but showed injury patterns consistent with what we've seen. Here, the silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Sister Mary's rosary beads clicking together as her hands shook with barely controlled rage. She had spent 4 decades protecting children, had seen the worst that humanity could inflict on its most vulnerable members. But this level of calculated evil challenged her faith in ways she had never experienced. "There's more," Detective Chen continued, opening another folder. "We've been in contact with law enforcement in the other states where Jennifer operated. What we're finding is a pattern of systemic failures that allowed her to move from jurisdiction to jurisdiction without anyone connecting the dots. The next set of documents showed how Jennifer had used her education and social connections to build credibility in each new location. She had attended parenting classes, volunteered with children's organizations, and cultivated relationships with social workers and family court judges, who later provided glowing character references when questions arose about the children in her care. "She's a psychopath," Father Miguel said quietly. "Not in the colloquial sense, but in the clinical sense. Someone capable of mimicking human emotions and social connections while feeling nothing but contempt for the people she manipulates." Sister Mary studied the photographs of the other children, faces that would now haunt her dreams alongside Aaliyah's. Each one represented a life cut short or permanently damaged, a family destroyed, a community that had failed to protect its most vulnerable members. But they also represented something else, evidence that could prevent future tragedies if the legal system was willing to look beyond individual cases to see the larger pattern. "What happens now?" Sister Mary asked. "Now we build a case that goes beyond child abuse charges," Detective Chen replied. "We're talking about federal charges, crossing state lines to commit crimes against children, conspiracy, possibly racketeering if we can prove she was part of a larger network. The FBI is taking over the investigation, and they've asked me to be the liaison because of my relationship with the victims and witnesses." The weight of that statement settled over them all. What had begun as Sister Mary's desperate attempt to protect one little girl had uncovered a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for years, enabled by systemic failures and the kind of institutional blindness that prioritized procedure over protection. "There's something else," Detective Chen said, hesitating before opening the final folder. "Something that's going to be particularly difficult for you to hear. Sister Mary, the last set of documents showed that Jennifer had specifically researched St. Catherine's Children's Home and Sister Mary herself before targeting the Washington family. She had known about Sister Mary's reputation as a fierce advocate for children, had calculated that the elderly nun's protective instincts would eventually lead to questions about Aaliyah's welfare, and had apparently planned to use those very instincts as evidence of institutional bias if her abuse was ever discovered. She wanted to be caught, Sister Mary said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. Or at least she had a plan for what to do when she was caught. It appears that way. Her attorney's strategy of discrediting the witnesses and blaming the system, that wasn't improvised. That was planned from the beginning. Sister Mary closed her eyes and said a prayer that had sustained her through the darkest moments of her ministry. "Grant me the strength to face whatever evil exists in this world, and the wisdom to fight it without losing my soul in the process." When she opened her eyes, her resolve had crystallized into something harder and more determined than simple protective instinct. This was no longer just about Aaliyah, or even about the other children Jennifer had hurt. This was about confronting a kind of evil that could only exist when good people chose comfort over courage, when systems prioritized their own preservation over their stated mission, when society decided that some children were expendable as long as the machinery of daily life continued to function smoothly. "Detective Chen," Sister Mary said, her voice carrying 42 years of moral authority, "what do you need from me to make sure this woman never hurts another child?" The federal courthouse in Cleveland loomed like a monument to justice deferred, its limestone facade weathered by decades of Ohio winters and the weight of countless human tragedies that had passed through its doors. Sister Mary stood on the courthouse steps at dawn on the morning of Jennifer Walsh's trial, watching the sun rise over a city that seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what was to come. She had been preparing for this moment for 3 months, ever since the FBI had taken over the investigation and transformed a local child abuse case into a federal prosecution that would be watched by law enforcement agencies across the country. The past 90 days had been a whirlwind of preparation that tested every assumption Sister Mary had ever held about justice, faith, and the capacity of human institutions to confront true evil. FBI Special Agent Rebecca Martinez, no relation to Dr. Martinez, who worked with Aaliyah, had become Sister Mary's liaison with the federal investigation. And the two women had developed an unlikely partnership built on mutual respect and shared determination to see Jennifer Walsh held accountable for her crimes. "Are you ready for this?" Agent Martinez asked as she approached Sister Mary on the courthouse steps, her breath visible in the cold morning air. At 38, she was young enough to be Sister Mary's daughter, but her eyes held the kind of weariness that came from years of investigating crimes against children. "The defense is going to come at you hard. They're going to try to paint you as an emotional old woman who let her feelings cloud her judgment." Sister Mary adjusted her simple black veil and straightened her shoulders. "Let them try. I've been dealing with bullies and predators for 42 years. Jennifer Walsh's attorney doesn't frighten me." But even as she spoke those words, Sister Mary felt the familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest that had been her constant companion since agreeing to serve as the prosecution's key witness. The federal case had expanded far beyond Aaliyah's abuse to include charges related to the other children Jennifer had harmed across multiple states. Sister Mary would be testifying not just about what she had observed and documented, but about patterns of behavior that stretched back years and involved victims who could no longer speak for themselves. The courthouse filled quickly as the morning progressed, with journalists, law enforcement officers, social workers, and family members of Jennifer's victims creating a palpable tension that seemed to charge the air itself. Sister Mary took her place in the gallery beside Father Miguel, who had driven down from Millbrook to provide moral support, and Marcus Washington, whose face had aged visibly over the past months as the full scope of Jennifer's crimes became clear. Aaliyah was not present. At 3 years old, she was too young to testify, and Dr. Martinez had strongly recommended that she be kept away from the proceedings to protect her ongoing psychological recovery. But her presence was felt throughout the courtroom in the form of photographs, medical records, and the collection of drawings that had become central pieces of evidence in the prosecution's case. Jennifer Walsh entered the courtroom flanked by her legal team, and Sister Mary was struck by how different she looked from the confident, manipulative woman who had terrorized a little girl for months. Dressed in a conservative navy suit, with her blonde hair pulled back in a simple bun, Jennifer appeared almost fragile, vulnerable in a way that Sister Mary recognized as yet another calculated performance designed to generate sympathy from the jury. Federal Prosecutor David Chen, Detective Sarah Chen's older brother, as it turned out, had spent weeks preparing Sister Mary for her testimony, walking her through the timeline of events, helping her organize her thoughts and documentation, and ensuring that she understood the legal technicalities that would govern what she could and could not say on the witness stand. "Remember," he had told her during their final preparation session, "stick to what you observed directly. Don't speculate about Jennifer's motivations or psychological state. Let the evidence speak for itself and trust the jury to see what you saw." But as Sister Mary watched Jennifer whisper confidentially with her attorneys, she wondered if any jury could truly comprehend the calculated nature of the evil they were confronting. Jennifer Walsh wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. She was something far more dangerous, a predator who understood exactly how to exploit the systems designed to protect children, who could mimic human emotions with chilling precision, who could present herself as a savior while systematically destroying the lives of those she claimed to help. The opening statements painted two radically different pictures of the same woman. Prosecutor Chen presented Jennifer as a serial predator who had spent years perfecting a system of infiltrating vulnerable families, gaining trust through manipulation and false expertise, and then systematically abusing the children placed in her care, while covering her tracks through careful documentation and strategic relationship building within the child welfare system. Jennifer's lead attorney, Robert Garrison, countered with a narrative that portrayed his client as a well-meaning woman who had genuinely tried to help. Our troubled children, but had been overwhelmed by the complexity of their needs and the failures of the system around her. According to Garrison's version of events, Jennifer was herself a victim of a rush to judgment, of a witch hunt mentality that needed someone to blame for systemic failures, of overzealous investigators who had decided on her guilt before examining the evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Garrison said in his opening statement, his voice carrying the practiced authority that had served him well in decades of defending the indefensible. "What you're going to see in this case is not evidence of criminal behavior, but evidence of a system so broken that it destroys the very people who try to help it function. Jennifer Walsh is not a predator. She's a scapegoat." Sister Mary felt her stomach clench as she listened to Garrison's smooth rhetoric, recognizing the same manipulative techniques that Jennifer had used to gain access to Aaliyah and the other children. The lawyer was attempting to use the jury's potential sympathy for overwhelmed caregivers and their frustration with bureaucratic failures to obscure the very real evidence of deliberate, calculated abuse. The first week of testimony established the broader pattern of Jennifer's crimes, with FBI agents presenting evidence from the multi-state investigation, forensic computer experts explaining the digital trail that had revealed Jennifer's methodical approach to selecting and grooming victims, and law enforcement officers from other jurisdictions describing similar cases that had initially been treated as isolated incidents. Dr. Patricia Reynolds took the stand on Wednesday morning, her testimony providing the medical foundation for the prosecution's case. She walked the jury through Aaliyah's injuries in clinical detail, explaining how the pattern and severity of trauma could only have resulted from deliberate abuse rather than accidental injury. "In my 30 years as an emergency physician," Dr. Reynolds said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her testimony, "I have never seen accidental injuries that match the pattern of what we observed in Aaliyah, Washington. The timing, the location, the severity, everything pointed to systematic, intentional abuse. But it was Dr. Sarah Martinez's testimony about Aaliyah's psychological state that truly brought home the human cost of Jennifer's crimes. The child psychologist had worked with Aaliyah for months, documenting her gradual recovery while also analyzing the drawings and behavioral observations that revealed the extent of the trauma she had suffered. What we see in Aaliyah's case, Dr. Martinez explained to the jury, is a child who had learned to expect pain from the people who claimed to love her. Her drawings show a progression from normal childhood imagery to increasingly dark and chaotic representations of fear and violence. This isn't the result of general trauma or adjustment difficulties. This is the specific psychological signature of systematic abuse by a trusted caregiver. As the prosecution built its case piece by piece, Sister Mary found herself thinking about all the children who had passed through St. Catherine's over the years, wondering how many others might have suffered in silence because the adults around them lacked the courage or wisdom to see what was happening. The trial was about Jennifer Walsh, but it was also about something larger, about society's willingness to protect its most vulnerable members, about the choice between comfortable ignorance and difficult truth, about the price of failing to act when action was desperately needed. Friday afternoon brought the moment Sister Mary had been preparing for since agreeing to testify. As she rose from her seat in the gallery and walked toward the witness stand, she carried with her not just her own observations and documentation, but the weight of every child who had ever been failed by the systems designed to protect them, the oath she took to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, felt like a sacred vow that connected her testimony to the larger mission that had defined her entire adult life. As she settled into the witness chair and looked out at the packed courtroom, Sister Mary whispered a silent prayer for the strength to do justice, not just to Aaliyah's story, but to the stories of all the children whose voices had been silenced by violence and fear. The moment she had been preparing for her entire life was about to begin. Please state your full name for the record. Sister Mary Catherine Murphy, but I've been known as Sister Mary for 42 years at St. Catherine's Children's Home in Millbrook, Ohio. Prosecutor David Chen approached the witness stand with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that the next hour would determine the outcome of months of investigation and preparation. Sister Mary sat straight-backed in the witness chair, her weathered hands folded calmly in her lap, her eyes steady, despite the weight of dozens of gazes fixed upon her from every corner of the packed federal courtroom. Sister Mary, how long have you worked with children in the foster care and social services system? 4 decades and 2 years, Mr. Chen. I've cared for over 800 children during that time, from infants to teenagers aging out of the system. In your professional experience, have you developed expertise in recognizing signs of abuse and neglect? Sister Mary's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had seen humanity at both its best and worst. Unfortunately, yes. When you spend your life caring for society's most vulnerable children, you learn to read the signs that others miss or choose to ignore. Chen moved to the evidence table and retrieved a thick manila folder that contained the progression of Aaliyah's drawings, the visual documentation that had become central to the prosecution's case. I'm showing you what has been marked as Prosecution Exhibit 47. Can you identify these documents? These are drawings created by Aaliyah Washington during art therapy sessions at St. Catherine's. I supervised many of these sessions myself, and I can authenticate both the dates and the circumstances under which they were created. Can you walk the jury through what these drawings show? Sister Mary opened the folder with reverent care, as if handling sacred relics rather than crayon scribbles on construction paper. The first drawing showed a simple house with stick figures standing beneath a bright yellow sun, the kind of innocent artwork that adorned refrigerators in loving homes across America. This first drawing was created about 2 weeks after Aaliyah came to us, and about 6 weeks before the weekend visits with her stepmother began. You can see the bright colors, the organized composition, the representation of family togetherness. This is what we would expect from a child her age who was beginning to feel safe and stable. She turned to the second drawing, dated 3 weeks later. This was created after the 3rd weekend visit. Notice how the colors have changed. More browns and blacks. The figures are smaller and separated from each other. The house no longer has windows or a door. Psychologically, this suggests a child who is beginning to feel trapped and isolated. The jury leaned forward as Sister Mary continued through the progression, her clinical observations interwoven with the heartbreak of someone who had watched a little girl's world grow progressively darker. With each drawing, the imagery became more chaotic, more violent, more desperate. And this final drawing, Sister Mary said, her voice catching slightly as she held up a piece of paper that was mostly covered in angry black scribbles, with small red marks scattered throughout. It was created 2 days before I brought Aaliyah to the emergency room. The child who drew this was no longer trying to represent her world. She was screaming for help in the only way she knew how. Sister Mary, did you ever express your concerns about these changes to the appropriate authorities? Multiple times. I documented every conversation, every phone call, every meeting. I was told repeatedly that children in Aaliyah's situation often experience regression and behavioral difficulties during family reunification processes, and that patience and consistency were the appropriate responses. Chen's next question cut to the heart of the institutional failures that had enabled Jennifer's abuse to continue. What would have had to happen for your concerns to be taken seriously by the system? Sister Mary was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words with the care of someone who understood that her answer would be quoted in newspapers and used in policy discussions for years to come. The system would have had to value a child's well-being more than institutional convenience. It would have had to recognize that sometimes the people with the most credentials and the best presentations are the ones most skilled at hiding their true nature. In your opinion, based on your 4 decades of experience, was Aaliyah Washington's abuse preventable? The courtroom fell silent as Sister Mary considered her response. Every person present, jurors, lawyers, journalists, family members, understood that they were witnessing a moment of moral reckoning that transcended the specific charges against Jennifer Walsh. "Yes," Sister Mary said finally, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "If even one person in authority had listened when a little girl's body language told them she was afraid, if anyone had questioned why a child was regressing instead of progressing, if the system had prioritized protection over process, then yes, Aaliyah's suffering could have been prevented." Chen nodded, understanding that his witness had just delivered the prosecution's most powerful statement. "No further questions, Your Honor." But as Robert Garrison rose for cross-examination, his predatory smile suggested that the most difficult part of Sister Mary's testimony was yet to come. Robert Garrison approached the witness stand like a shark that had scented blood in the water. His expensive suit immaculate and his silver hair perfectly styled, despite the emotional intensity that had filled the courtroom all morning. Sister Mary met his gaze steadily, her hands still folded calmly in her lap, drawing strength from 4 decades of confronting bullies who used their power to harm those who could not defend themselves. "Sister Murphy," Garrison began, deliberately using her formal name in a transparent attempt to diminish the personal connection she had established with the jury. "You've had quite an emotional investment in this case, haven't you? I've had a professional and moral investment in protecting a child who was being systematically abused, yes." Garrison's smile was cold and calculated. "But isn't it true that your emotional attachment to this particular child has clouded your professional judgment, that you've allowed your feelings to override objective assessment?" Sister Mary's voice remained steady, though those who knew her well would have recognized the slight tightening around her eyes that indicated controlled anger. "Mr. Garrison, if caring about a child's welfare constitutes clouded judgment, then I proudly plead guilty to that charge. Sister, you're not a licensed psychologist, are you? You're not a medical doctor? You have no formal training in child psychology or trauma assessment. I have 42 years of hands-on experience caring for traumatized children. Mr. Garrison, I've learned to recognize abuse not from textbooks, but from holding hundreds of broken children while they tried to heal from what adults had done to them." Garrison moved to his evidence table and retrieved a thick file that Sister Mary recognized with growing dread. "I'm showing you what has been marked as Defense Exhibit 12, your complete personnel file from the diocese archives. Sister Murphy, isn't it true that you have a documented history of what your supervisors have called excessive emotional involvement with the children in your care?" The attack was more personal than Sister Mary had expected, and she felt her cheeks flush as she realized that Garrison was attempting to use her greatest strength, her fierce protective love for vulnerable children, as evidence of professional incompetence. "There have been occasions," Sister Mary said carefully, "when I have advocated more aggressively than some administrators preferred for children who had no other advocates." "In fact," Garrison continued, his voice growing more aggressive, "you've been formally reprimanded 3 times over the past decade for what your supervisors termed insubordination when it came to following proper protocols regarding child placement decisions. Haven't you?" Sister Mary's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I have been reprimanded for refusing to return children to situations where I believed they would be harmed." "Yes, and isn't it true that in 2 of those cases, subsequent investigations found no evidence of abuse or neglect, and that your concerns were determined to be unfounded?" The question hung in the air like a trap, and Sister Mary understood that her answer would determine not just Jennifer Walsh's fate, but the credibility of everyone who had ever trusted their instincts over institutional procedures when a child's life was at stake. "Mr. Garrison," Sister Mary said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "in my 42 years of protecting children, I have erred on the side of caution hundreds of times. I would rather be wrong 99 times about suspected abuse than be wrong once and have a child die because I followed protocol instead of my conscience. But your conscience isn't evidence, is it, sister? Your feelings don't constitute proof of criminal behavior." Sister Mary leaned slightly forward in her chair, and when she spoke, her voice carried the accumulated authority of 4 decades spent fighting for those who could not fight for themselves. "Mr. Garrison, you're asking me to separate my professional observations from my moral convictions, as if caring about the outcome somehow invalidates the expertise that led to those observations. But I've learned something over 42 years that you apparently haven't. Sometimes the most important evidence is written in a child's eyes, in their body language, in the way they flinch when they should feel safe. And sometimes the people with the most credentials and the smoothest presentations are the ones most skilled at fooling adults who prefer comfortable lies to difficult truths." The courtroom was silent as the weight of Sister Mary's words settled over everyone present. Even Garrison seemed momentarily at a loss for his next attack, his confident demeanor shaken by the moral authority in her voice. "Sister Murphy," he finally said, "you realize that my client's life and freedom depend on the accuracy of your testimony?" Sister Mary's response was immediate and unwavering. "Mr. Garrison, 7 children's lives depended on the accuracy of adults who chose not to see what was happening to them. I will not make that mistake again." Garrison's final question was delivered with desperation, disguised as authority. "So you're asking this jury to convict my client based on your feelings about some crayon drawings and your personal dislike of Jennifer Walsh?" Sister Mary looked directly at the jury as she delivered her final statement. "I'm asking this jury to convict your client based on medical evidence, documented behavioral changes, forensic computer analysis, and the systematic pattern of abuse that destroyed the lives of 7 innocent children. The drawings are just how one little girl found the courage to tell us what the adults around her had failed to see." "No further questions," Garrison said, returning to his table with the defeated posture of someone who had just lost the most important battle of his career. As Sister Mary stepped down from the witness stand, she knew that justice for Aaliyah and the other children was finally within reach. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and 17 minutes, long enough to suggest serious consideration of the evidence, short enough to indicate that the outcome was never truly in doubt. When the foreman stood to deliver the verdict on all 17 federal charges against Jennifer Walsh, his voice carried the weight of absolute moral certainty that resonated through every corner of the packed courtroom. Guilty on all counts. Sister Mary felt her knees weaken as the words washed over her. 42 years of accumulated tension finally releasing in a single moment of profound relief. Around her, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of tears, applause, and quiet prayers of thanksgiving from people who had waited months to hear justice pronounced for 7 children who could no longer speak for themselves. Jennifer Walsh's reaction was perhaps the most telling evidence of her true nature that the trial had produced. As the guilty verdicts were read one by one, her carefully constructed mask of victimhood fell away completely, revealing the cold fury of someone who had been accustomed to manipulating every situation to her advantage and could not comprehend that her victims had finally found their voice. Through the courage of an elderly nun who refused to look away, the sentencing hearing 3 weeks later brought closure that was both satisfying and sobering. Federal Judge Patricia Morrison, a woman in her 60s who had presided over countless difficult cases during her 2 decades on the bench, delivered a statement that would be quoted in law enforcement training materials and child welfare policy discussions for years to come. "Mrs. Walsh," Judge Morrison said, her voice carrying the accumulated wisdom of someone who had seen both the best and worst of human nature, "you have committed crimes that strike at the very foundation of our social contract, the promise that adults will protect children rather than exploit them. Your systematic abuse of 7 innocent children represents not just individual acts of violence, but an assault on the institutions and systems designed to safeguard our most vulnerable citizens." The sentence, 47 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole, ensured that Jennifer Walsh would never again have the opportunity to harm a child. More importantly, it sent a clear message to other predators who might be tempted to exploit the vulnerabilities in the child welfare system that such behavior would be met with the full force of federal prosecution. But for Sister Mary, the most meaningful moment of closure came not in the courtroom, but in the quiet playroom at St. Catherine's Children's Home on a sunny Tuesday morning, 6 months after the trial. Aaliyah Washington, now 3.5 years old, sat at the art table with a box of crayons and a fresh piece of construction paper, her small tongue poking out slightly in concentration. As she worked on a new drawing, the little girl who had once filled pages with black scribbles and red marks of pain now created pictures, filled with bright colors and happy faces. The house in her latest drawing had windows and a door, flowers in the yard, and stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun. Most remarkably, one of the figures was clearly labeled Sister Mary, in the wobbly handwriting of a child just learning to form letters. "Tell me about your picture." "Sweetheart," Sister Mary said, settling into the small chair beside Aaliyah with the careful movements of someone whose 71-year-old bones reminded her daily of 4 decades spent bending down to comfort frightened children. "This is my family," Aaliyah said proudly, pointing to each figure in turn. "This is Daddy, and this is Sister Mary, and this is me. We're all safe now." Those words, "we're all safe now," represented a victory that transcended legal proceedings and courtroom drama. They spoke to the fundamental purpose of every institution, every law, every professional commitment that was designed to protect children, creating a world where innocence could flourish without fear, where trust could be rebuilt after betrayal, where healing was possible even after the deepest wounds. Marcus Washington had undergone his own transformation during the months following Jennifer's conviction. The guilt and self-recrimination that had consumed him in the immediate aftermath of Aaliyah's hospitalization had gradually given way to a quiet determination to rebuild his relationship with his daughter and ensure that her future would be fundamentally different from her recent past. "I can never undo what happened," he told Sister Mary during one of their regular meetings to discuss Aaliyah's progress. "But I can make sure she knows that what Jennifer did to her wasn't love, wasn't normal, and will never happen again." The broader impact of the case extended far beyond Millbrook, Ohio, or even the federal court system where Jennifer Walsh had been convicted. Sister Mary found herself reluctantly thrust into a national conversation about child welfare reform, speaking at conferences and policy meetings where her testimony about the failures that had enabled Jennifer's crimes helped shape new protocols for recognizing and responding to systematic abuse. The most significant change came in the form of legislation that would forever be known as Aaliyah's Law, federal mandate requiring cross-jurisdictional communication about suspected child abuse cases and establishing new standards for the training and oversight of social workers, foster care administrators, and family court officials. But perhaps the most important legacy of Aaliyah's case was the reminder it provided to everyone involved in child protection that the most sophisticated procedures and well-intentioned policies were meaningless without the moral courage to act when action was needed, even when that action challenged institutional convenience or professional comfort. As Sister Mary tucked Aaliyah into bed that Tuesday evening, listening to the little girl's prayers that now included gratitude for safety and requests for blessings. On all the other children who need protecting, she reflected on the words that had guided her through 42 years of difficult decisions. Grant me the wisdom to know when to bend the rules in service of a higher law, and the courage to act when a child's life hangs in the balance. The prayer had been answered, justice had been served, and most importantly, one little girl would grow up knowing that when evil had threatened to destroy her, there had been adults willing to fight for her with everything they had. In the end, that was enough.